Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as I show you how to overwinter your tuberous begonia bulbs. So let's go. Welcome to my barn. It has been very cold. We had our first hard freeze last night. And in my barn, I did bring in a bunch of plants that I still need to work on, one of which is my tuberous begonia. I successfully overwintered my tuberous begonia last winter. I had a bunch of them, and I was so thrilled to see them sprouting in the late winter, early spring. I potted them up, and some of them made their way into some nice containers in my landscape. Some of them stayed in their pre-sprouting trays the whole summer. The key is that they survived. Here where I live in zone 5B, the tuberous begonias will die once there is a hard freeze, which is why I brought them into my barn. Many people buy them just for 1 year and then throw them away. Personally, I think that's a waste of money. And why not try to overwinter them and propagate them so you can have more and more bulbs over time? There are a couple of ways I can overwinter them. One way that you can overwinter them is just to keep them in their pot. I personally have never tried that method, but I've heard that that method works for some people. I like to dig out the tuber and store it that way. It takes up a lot less space, so that works for me. And what's nice is my friend Linda gave me a few of her tuberous begonias to overwinter as well. So I'm very excited to have those in my collection. The key thing is in the early fall, you want to stop watering your tuberous begonias. You want them to basically dry out a little bit, and you definitely want to stop giving them fertilizer. The goal is you want those tubers to go dormant. Now, I admit mine were outside in the elements, so they are a little bit on the wetter side, but they've been in my barn for about 3 or 4 days drying, so that should help them. So now what I want to do is take you in for a closer look, show you some of the plants that we're working with today and what to do next. The end of the season, what ends up happening to your tuberous begonias is they basically start losing all of the flowers, the foliage, and they no longer are nice, lush, and green. They start to turn more of a yellow color. That's a good sign. That indicates that the plant is ready to be stored. And what you can see happens is a lot of times the leaves just naturally fall off. That is key. You do not want to just pull off all the foliage. You want it to fall off naturally when it's ready. So what I like to do is, first of all, take the tuberous begonias out of their container or pot or out of the landscape. And again, you can see that some of the foliage is coming off naturally. You don't want to force it. The next thing you want to do is carefully take off all the soil from around the tubers. I have to admit, I was not good about labeling all of my begonias, and I'm okay with that. They're for my own personal use, for my own landscape. So it will be a wonderful surprise next year once I get these sprouting again and once they're ready to bloom. I'm trying to be a little careful. I know you can be a little bit rougher if you want to be with these plants, but personally, I like to be a little more careful if I can help it. And as I'm taking the soil away, the leaves again are just starting to fall off. Now, what I like to do is there is definitely, I can feel it, there's definitely a big tuber in here. But there's also a ton of soil still on the tuber. What I like to do is just place the tuber with the soil, and if there are any leaves attached, the leaves attached onto a tray kind of like this where there's holes in the bottom. And I'm going to let this dry out naturally. It might take a week or so, but the key is you want to make sure that this dries out enough so that you can then take off any remaining foliage and also remove any remaining soil on here. And this one here, as I was moving it to this section, the leaf just came off. The key with your tubers is if you notice any rot, you do not want to store those. You want to make sure you discard those, because what will happen is when you're storing all your tubers and they're all right next to each other, if you have one that's rotten, it can spread the rot to the other tubers, and that's not good. And sometimes you might not know that it's rotten until the soil has dried off and you take a closer look at the tuber. But I'm just feeling this one and I can tell it's very firm. It's not mushy, so it should be okay. And this was one that definitely sat in its container all summer, as well as this one. But the good news is they're still alive. I always tell people gardening is fun, but boy, gardening can be so expensive. So why not save money where you can? And when it comes to these type of tubers, they are just so beautiful. I love this type of begonia. I want more of it in my landscape. And I can tell when I took this tuber out of this pot that the tuber definitely got bigger. It was the full size of that pot. And I can see that these stems do not want to come off. So I'm not going to force it. I'm just going to leave them on there. And this was definitely, I would say, more on the pot bound side. So the soil even does not want to easily come off. I'll take a little bit of it off, but then the rest of it, we're just going to let it dry. You can be a little rough, but you don't want to be too rough. You don't want to damage your tuber. Isn't that just gorgeous? These two begonias came from my friend Linda. She was very generous and she gave me two of the few that she had. She might have had 5 total. I'm not sure how many, but that was very nice of her to share some of them with me. I find it so much easier doing it this way. I definitely could take this whole pot and just put this in my garage or in my basement and overwinter it that way. But honestly, this takes up so much room. I don't want to give up this much room for this plant, especially because I know it worked for me last year to overwinter just the tuber. And what happens every year when you keep overwintering your tuberous begonias is that the tuber gets bigger and bigger, which means your plant gets bigger and bigger. So think about it. If you were to buy the tuber every year, it's probably a pretty small size. The size may be smaller. But if you give it time, give it a number of years, you can end up with a much bigger tuber, which equals a much bigger plant. And then you can propagate it too and get more plants that way. Now, I do not like to wash off my tubers. I don't want to get them too wet. I don't want them to rot. The key is to let them dry out for a few days, maybe a week, as long as it takes. Then take off any excess soil from the base, take off any foliage from the top, and you should be okay. In another video, I will definitely give an update and show you what this looks like after all of this is removed from the top and all the soil is removed from the bottom. So definitely stay tuned until the end because I want to give you an update on how some other bulbs are looking that we did in a previous video. I'm overwintering my calla lilies and I showed you what to do with them to prepare them to be overwintered. So at the end of this video, I'm going to quickly show you what they look like. It's been about a week that they've been drying. They are now fully dry and they are ready for storage. And what I show you for that method in terms of preparing them for storage will apply to this bulb as well. Same type of process. This is all good dirt. This can go back out on a flower bed or in my compost pile, or I can top dress a raised bed. Nothing gets wasted. All this foliage, when it dies back, this can go in my compost pile. Part of me is tempted to label these two dahlias right here with the color and what they are. But I think there's something to be said about the element of surprise. I feel like we don't have enough surprises in life. So for that reason, I will not be labeling these. I want to surprise myself next year. And I'll surprise you when I make a video showing you how to pot these up and then give you an update on what they look like when they're blooming. And look how big, that is huge. I can tell that that's almost the full size of that tuber. Okay, not bad. We ended up with 5 of these tuberous begonias. I may end up having 1 or 2 more as I work on plants that are here in the barn. And if I find any more, I'll be sure to do the same exact process. So a couple of things. I'm going to give it about a week, maybe two, depends on how long, for these to get fully dry, for all the leaves to fall off. And then I'm going to take off all the excess dirt. I'm going to remove any dead foliage. And then what I'm going to do is the same exact thing which I did last year. And that worked for me. What I did was I stored these in a cardboard box, but you can also store them in a paper bag or a mesh bag. I haven't tried either of those, but I've heard those methods work as well. The biggest thing is the temperature where you store these. You want to make sure that they're in a cool, dark location. And last year I stored these in my garage. My garage does not fall below freezing. It does get to just barely below 40 degrees on the coldest winter nights or winter days, but it generally stays between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the optimal temperature for storing your tuberous begonia bulbs. Now, the few days where it gets kind of cold in my garage, I was really good and I just covered them with a little bit of protection, like a blanket, just to make sure that they didn't freeze. You do not want these to freeze. And then I check on them about once a month. And if they feel like they're getting a little too dry, I give them a spritz of water. But you don't want them to get soggy or too wet. You just want them to not fully dry out either. And then in the late winter, early spring, when I went out and checked on these, I noticed that they were starting to sprout. That's when I started potting them up. Generally, I like to pot them up into a small container that's about the size of the tuber and just get them sprouted so that they start growing. And then after that, after the danger of frost, I can then put them out in my landscape or in a nicer, prettier pot. Okay, let me show you what my calla lily bulbs look like. It's been a few weeks and they are fully dry now. I wanted to give you an update on these because this process is very similar to the process you're going to follow when it comes to your tuberous begonias. And I was able to get off a lot of the soil when I took these out of their containers. But at this time, if I had a brush, which I don't right now, I could use a brush and I could just take off any more soil off of here. But generally speaking, you can see that they're very clean. The next thing that I want to do is I just want to cut off any roots that are on here because we don't need those at this time. Now, if you store plants like these calla lilies or plants like the tuberous begonias somewhere where it's too warm, what's going to happen is it's just going to force the tubers or the bulbs or the corms to break dormancy, and it's going to tell the plant to start growing again and start sprouting and start putting its energy into the plant. You don't want to do that. And that's why it's important to store them in a location that's cool enough. If it's too warm, it's going to cause them to sprout. If it's too cold, it's going to cause them to freeze and die. So you want to make sure you find that right balance. So these look pretty good. What I'll end up doing is just going through all of them, taking off all the roots. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be storing these in a cardboard box. And in the cardboard box, I'm going to make sure that none of them are touching each other. That's very important because if for whatever reason one of them is rotting or starts rotting during the winter months, I don't want it to spread the rot to the other calla lilies that are here or the tuberous begonias when we store those. And I store them in peat moss, but I have heard other people store them in wood shavings, and some people don't store them in anything. But I did store them in peat moss last year, and I pre-moistened it just a tiny bit. I checked on them a few times during the winter months. When I felt that they were getting a little too dry, I just used a water bottle and I squirted a little bit of water on the peat moss. Now, all of these calla lilies never made it out of their pre-sprouting trays. Otherwise, they would have been much bigger for sure. And last year, I remember specifically dividing these, which is why I have so many of them and which is why they're pretty small in size. It's all good. Next year, my goal is to get these out of their pre-sprouting trays and get them potted up so that they can look beautiful again and get bigger. Yes, my barn is messy. But anyway, I have a bunch of plants over here I still need to deal with. And as we pan this way, I have a bunch of gladiolas. I have peacock orchids. It'll be good for me to show you my process for overwintering these types of bulbs as well. I hope you learned something new from this video, and it's maybe not too late in some of the zones that you live in. A lot of times at the end of the season, big box stores are selling very tender plants and bulbs, such as tuberous begonias or gladiolas or dahlias, different plants like that. You can definitely try to overwinter those. The key is to get those plants and stock up on them. And if you don't have time this year, there's always next year. Just keep watching videos like these, take it all in, learn, and then get ready for next year. I don't know about you, but I'm already excited about the next growing season. I hope you've been able to get out in your gardens, and until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.